Yo, what's up? Welcome to my channel. You've heard from the rest, now hear from the best. I'm just gonna keep messing around. Alright, so I'm not gonna do the whole video here, but this is Kristi Burke. I recently discovered her channel, and the whole appeal to her channel, the reason why I even clicked on the video, is that she brings up a topic here that was incredibly important in my conversion back into the church. So for those that don't know, I left the church sometime between the ages of 12 and 15. I don't know exactly when, but I was away from the church for about 20 years. I came back to the church specifically because after my third time reading the Bible all the way through, that's front to back, I had issues with Paul as relates to Jesus. And it's the reason why I now know a lot of the things about the Bible that I do know now. For instance, that the epistles were written before the Gospels. That's very important when you read the Gospels and you're like, hey, how come what Jesus is saying doesn't really sound like what Paul's saying? It's important to know what came first. It's important to know the development of the text. It's important to know which epistles are definitely by Paul and which ones might be by pseudo-Paul. It's important to know all that kind of context. It's important to know how these things were written, whether they were handwritten by Paul, whether they were dictated by Paul, whether it's someone else writing in Paul's voice, whether it's teachings of Paul that were passed on. All that's important. The same thing with Jesus. It's important to know what does it mean that the synoptic gospels seem to relate to each other and that John seems to be something completely different. What is going on in Luke? What's going on with Luke? Because Luke seems to be a complete work with Acts and seems to be separate from the other two synoptics, but you can't really separate out Luke because Luke is relying on a lot of the same wording. Why does the wording match on these two but not on these three but not so much in John? Like, those are all important things to know. And it can really break the faith of someone who's looking at it in a fundamental way. I know for me, when I tried to read the Bible for the first time and even the second time, and I didn't finish it. The first time I think I made it all the way to, I'm going to say Deuteronomy, and then the second time I made it a little bit further, like maybe 2 or 3 books down. But still, it was the giants and the floods and all, and I was like, people living for hundreds of years, thousands of years. It was just hard for me to understand what's going on. Get to a talking donkey and you're like, okay, what is this? So all that stuff's really important to have context for. It's important to understand genre, and it's important to understand when things were written, whether something was written post-exile, pre-exile, whether it was written contemporary with the authorship. All that stuff's important to know. Okay. Kristi is going to ask some questions that I asked. So I want to kind of comment from my point of view as someone who came back to the church through these questions. So these questions, these stumbling blocks, were a way for me back into my faith, not a way out of my faith. Because what made me leave the church was not the fact that the Bible had things that were hard to believe. It was that the way that the people in the church treated me and people that I cared about. And they weren't even necessarily of my same denomination or my same church. They were just people who identified as Christians, the way that they treated people of color, the way that they treated LGBTQ people. Mind you, I'm talking about the 1990s. I'm very old. But yeah, the way that they treated people made me leave the church and made me identify with the marginalized and made me an outcast in the church, in Christianity. And even now, as I'm do these kind of things, most Christians and Catholics don't really like the things that I have to say because I piss off everybody. I'm not taking any one particular side. I submit to the will of the church, and whatever the church teaches, that's where I'm at. Anything else, I'm going to say whatever I want, and my mind and my thoughts are my own. So, but anyway, let's get into this. Let's see what Kristi has to say. I think that's her name.
Hi, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kristi, and today I want to talk about Paul, the Apostle Paul, I had a vision on the road to Damascus. And
let's be clear, there is indication or implication that Paul was killing Christians, but the Bible doesn't really nail that down. So there is plausible deniability. Also, the Paul Saul thing, there's a little bit of gray area there on the renaming, whether that's just the Jewish name and the Roman name, whether or not it's two different characters. I mean, there's some play there. Not important for what she's going to talk about, but it's important to know that there is play there on these things, because when you're coming from a Christian tradition where all this stuff has already been ironed out, you might not realize that to the uninitiated, there are more questions here than exist for us as believers.
Now my life has changed and I'm no longer persecuting and killing Christians, but now I am a mouthpiece for Jesus Christ. Now, if you've been following me on TikTok for a while, you probably already know I've got some beef with Paul. I'm not a big fan, okay?
I was not a big fan of Paul originally. Paul is the reason why a Gentile like me can be a Christian. So he's super important, and yet he sounds misogynistic. He sounds homophobic. He sounds anti-Semitic. So there's some problems there. And then some of the stuff that he's saying, especially when it comes to grace, when it comes to faith, seems inconsistent within itself, because there's other Pauline writings that say the opposite, or seem to imply the opposite. There is areas where he seems to disagree with Peter, and he disagrees with James, and you're like, well, James is the brother of Jesus, and it's super important to the early church. Peter is the founder of the Catholic Church. He's the founder of two of the most important patriarchates that exist. He's the founder of Rome. He's the founder of Antioch. How are we going to get around this? It's super important stuff. And Paul seems to contradict him. And then most importantly, Paul seems to contradict Jesus, because Jesus is saying things that seems to say you have to work out your faith. That once you have been given the gift of grace, you then have to go do good works. And Paul seems to be saying the opposite. So, and then Paul seems to contradict himself on women, because on one hand, deaconesses are honored. On the other hand, no woman should have a voice in the church, or at least no woman should be teaching in the church or have a spot of authority. And it's like, well, you just acknowledged some deaconesses. So how do you work that one, Paul? So yeah, there's a lot of issues with Paul.
I don't like the guy. I don't trust him. I don't like his writings. And I don't think that he was really aligned with what was written about Jesus. I think they were teaching completely different messages. And it is my opinion that if Christians spent more time comparing the words of Jesus and the words of Paul, I think that they might have a lot of questions for Paul. And they might even see him as one of the false prophets that Jesus warned against.
So it's important to note that this is not original to her. A lot of Dawa type Islamic online apologists will use this line of reasoning with Paul. They will simply say, look, if the Gospels are the word of God or the word of Jesus, and then Paul's a writer and he's talking later and he's saying something different, well, then maybe he's one of the false prophets, right? And maybe he's one of the ones that you're warned about, because he never met Jesus directly, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Don't panic. Don't freak out. You're okay. Paul wrote first. He's actually the first writer in the New Testament. The Gospels are going to come later. Each Gospel is by a different author, possibly by a different author group. A school or a church that they ascribe to Matthean thinking, or Marcion thinking. Not Marcion like Marcion the heretic, but Marcion like Mark. They're ascribing to Lucian thinking, Luke, or Johannian thinking, John. And so they write these things based on the tradition they've been handed down from this particular apostle. That's important to note, because the oral tradition develops over time as Christianity grows. The writings of Paul are epistles writing to different churches for different circumstances. And a lot of the misogyny or seeming anti-Semitism of Paul can be reconciled and can be hermeneutically explained. But if you don't have hermeneutics, and if you don't have a process of reconciliation with the word and with history and facts and dates, if you don't have a historical context, it can get very dicey. For instance, the explanation on Paul saying when women should speak or women should dress has to do with a particular church and a particular situation. And if you don't have that historical context, it just looks like he's being misogynistic. But when you hear what was going on in the churches at that time, you understand why he was saying what he was saying. And it starts making way more sense. But it's a limited context that he's talking about. But there are universal implications to what he's saying. So that's all important to note. Paul is super important to the New Testament, and he is incredibly important to anyone who's not a Jew who believes in Jesus Christ. Without that, it would just be a kind of Jewish Christianity. So don't discount Paul. Don't get rid of Paul. You need Paul. Paul's super important. And you will learn to respect him and eventually love him once you realize what he's saying and what he's not saying. But yeah, it sounds bad the first time you really look at what he's saying and compare it to Jesus' words. But perception is not reality.
And the reason I say this is because in Matthew 24, Jesus warned of false prophets. Jesus was talking about the destruction of the temple and the signs of the end times. It says in verse 1, Jesus left the temple and was walking away, and his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. He says, "Do you see all these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." And his disciples say, "When will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age?" So his disciples want to know what to look for. What signs should we be on the lookout for the end times? And, Jesus answers. And he says, first of all, before anything else, he says, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars." And then he goes on to talk about, all of the signs. But he starts out with a very important statement. Watch out, nobody deceives you. People are going to come, they're going to trick you, they're going to deceive you, and they're going to lead people astray.
So it's important to understand that the message that the church was protecting when they wrote this down on paper, when it went from an oral tradition to a written tradition, was the tradition that Paul had set up, including deacons and the structure of the church, elders, overseers. All that is packed into this. I know that in the narrative, these things are taking place before Paul even was converted, maybe even before Paul was his own man. But by the time that it's actually being written, it's actually taking place after Paul had already written his epistles, and maybe even after Paul had already been martyred. So that's important to understand, that the tradition they are protecting is the tradition that Paul helped set up. Context.
So be on the lookout for those people. And then in verse 11, after he kind of discusses, some of the things that they'll experience, like earthquakes and violence and war, in verse 11, he says, "Again, many false prophets will appear and deceive many people." And then again, in verse 23, he reiterates it, and he says, "At that time, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Messiah, there he is,' do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect."
So this is actually talking about a thing that you can read about in Josephus, and I think possibly in Philo. So there are other prophets, there are other famous messiahs at this time, or false messiahs, and their groups just simply die out after they're executed, whether it's through stoning or whether it's through crucifixion. And that is what, during the persecutions, and there's some question on who exactly was martyred or not martyred, but if you go with the tradition, the reason for the martyrdoms is because they thought exactly what happened with these other false messiahs would happen with them, which is once you martyr them, that's it, the group disappears. That's not what happened. Just like with the Zealots didn't just go away, they kept fighting. So you're going to have martyrdoms happen and the faith increase. The seeds of the martyrs, the watering of the martyrs. So the martyrs water the ground and make the seeds grow. And so you would see relics as being planted underneath a It'd be underneath the church, but it'd be in a tomb or in a little area under the altar. And then the church grows from that. From their faith grows the church. Peter, Paul, it's very important for how Catholics understand the first pope and how the tradition gets passed on and all that kind of stuff. But basically, the structure of the church, the way that the church is founded, is through martyrdom. And that martyrdom, that relic, is going to be important to the sanctifying of the church, or the holiness of the church. It's supposed to kind of inspire people to follow a specific martyr or specific saint and their philosophy and their theology and their example. And it's how you know you're on the correct path, because these people died for the faith. Yeah. All that's missing with what she's explaining here, because you're basically changing the timeline to fit the narrative. Well, the narrative is different than how things were put together when they were written.
This is loaded because if you think about Paul and who Paul was, he came on scene very early and he was persecuting these followers of the way, as it was called in the beginning. It was not Christianity, it was the way.
I've never heard it be called followers of the way, and I've read a lot of ancient texts. I don't know where she's getting that, but it doesn't bother me. The early Christians thought they were Jews. The early Christians were, in fact, Jews. It isn't until they start bringing in Gentiles that you really see the majority of who considers themselves a Christian to change. It isn't until the church synagogue split that you really get a strong dividing line between Christians and Jews. You can actually read about this in Acts. It's super important. It's basically at the point where Paul takes over the story of Acts and it becomes a story about Paul. Just understand that up until that point, up until the split, up until Jewish people started kicking Christians out of the synagogue, a church and synagogue meant the same thing. They were the same words. It isn't until that split happens that they become two different things, that one becomes a Christian thing and one becomes a Jewish thing. And that's very important with the dream that Peter has with taking on eating of different flesh, of eating pork and eating shrimp. And those are the flesh that he's allowed to eat. Is also representative of different cultures. So it's letting different cultures in and saying, no, they too are sanctified. They too are one of us. This is no longer going to be a dividing line between Christians. Paul will say there is no Jew, there is no Christian, there is no slave, there is no master, there is no male, there is no female. You're just all Christian. And the first time they're called Christian and all that kind of stuff, all that plays into this. And she's just throwing that context out. So don't freak out. What she's saying, the doubt she's adding to it is not necessary. It's actually in the text, and you can read when this happens in Acts.
He was persecuting these people, and then he had a vision. He had an experience where Jesus came to him and basically changed his life and told him to turn from those ways and decided to make him a mouthpiece for Jesus. That's what Paul is claiming.
Mouthpiece for Jesus, I wouldn't use that wording only because that makes it sound like he was the first pope instead of Peter being the first pope. But, I mean, sure, he became an apostle.
But if you listen to Jesus, he's saying, hey, be careful. People are going to come through and they're going to claim to be me or, claim to speak for me. And they're going to deceive a lot of people. I would consider Paul to be someone who deceived a lot of people. If he wasn't preaching the true message, then a lot of people were deceived by Paul, because Paul, he was responsible for kind of the spread of Christianity. And I think it's interesting that Jesus says that false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive. Paul cast out demons. He performed miracles.
In the same kind of note, Jesus also said, once I am back with the Father, you will perform greater miracles than I. That you will do greater deeds than he himself had done, with the help of the Paraclete, which is the Holy Spirit.
He performed several miracles according to the text, according to the New Testament. And so he's checking the boxes, right? Like, he comes on scene. In Galatians 2:20, which was my favorite Bible verse in my teenage years, I had it painted above my bed.
Just to be clear, I grew up Catholic, so I can't do the Bible verse thing. I have to actually open the Bible to see what it says.
says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So he is making a statement about how he has essentially died.
Important to understand, and this is something that goes to another channel I sometimes comment on called Found Cause. They seem to not understand this, is theosis. That is becoming one with God. That process of theosis is what's being spoke of here. It is very biblical. Paul is talking about it. Later people, like St. John Damascus, St. Gregory Palamas, are going to talk about it, and they're going to expand this idea. But it is very biblical. Paul himself talks about theosis.
And Jesus took over, and now the one that's living through him is Jesus. So he's essentially propping himself up to be on the same level of Jesus. And it's so funny how so many Christians see...
Actually, he's arguing to try to prop himself up to be on the same level as the other apostles, because there was some doubt in that time period based on the writings of whether or not Paul could be considered legit. That's why he spends so much time learning before he even goes to the apostles, to get confirmed by them and to basically be sanctioned as officially a disciple of Christ. So when he goes to them and he says, hey, am I teaching anything that's wrong? And Peter and Paul and James and Peter and James are like, no, what you're saying is fine. You're good. Keep going. That's what that is. So he's putting himself on the same level as the apostles, not on the same level as Jesus. And the goal is to be in one body with Jesus Christ. So you're trying to become one with Jesus and be in one body, the body militant. So this body, the body of the church, would then, by being part of Jesus and Jesus being God, you also be one with God. So the idea is to become one with God. Theosis. And it's a process.
This as kind of an act of humility when you die to yourself and let Jesus live through you. And I think that what they're doing is they're actually putting themselves on the level of Jesus, and they're claiming that this isn't me, this is Jesus.
So in the Catholic and Orthodox and maybe even the Anglican Church, we have a thing called in persona Christi, which is where the priest play the role or take the role of Jesus while doing the Mass or while doing confession or any other kind of ritualistic service. You yourself, when you are forgiving in the name of Jesus. So your whole job is to spread the word that Jesus died for your sins and that you are forgiven. Now come, follow Jesus and sin no more. When you're doing that, you're in persona Christi. You're doing the role of Christ. You're saving people. That's what you're doing. So you are a Messiah for that particular person. You're out there as a prophet, as a king, as part of the royal priesthood, saving someone to let them know, hey, the good news, Jesus died for you. Come sin no more. You've been forgiven. Come on in and change your life, change your actions. That's what's going on there. So it's not the big hurdle or offensive thing that she thinks it is, nor is it the big hurdle or offensive thing that Calvinist thinks it is. It's a good thing.
Who I am now, who you perceive when you talk to me and interact with me, is Jesus. It's not me, it's Jesus. Like, that's exactly what pastors are doing. That's what people are doing when they say, like, I've died to myself and Jesus lives in me. You're basically calling yourself Christ.
I just explained that, so I don't have a problem with that. You're in persona Christi. You're representing Christ. So be a good person and do good works. Love your enemy. Love your neighbor. Love yourself, and love God above all.
You really are. And so, again, Paul is kind of propping himself up as Jesus. He's performing signs and wonders. It even says that he will lead astray as many as possible, even the elect.
And again, Jesus said, you would do greater miracles than I. Greater deeds than I. All right, I'm going to stop it there because this got a little long. If I come back to this video at any point, I'd gladly revisit it. If Kristi Burke wants to come on my channel anytime and talk religion or philosophy or even comic books and movies, she's welcome to. I don't have a TikTok, so I won't be doing that. I do have a Twitch. So, yeah, I mean, whatever. All right. Talk to you all later. Bye.